Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Siebert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
All right. Well, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where today's episode, we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome. This is not a diagnosable disorder or anything, but it's been around since the 80s. And this is really our fear of being exposed as a fraud. We don't believe that we have the competency to engage in a certain task or perform in a certain way. And so this constant fear of they're going to find me out. I'm a fraud.
I hear about this a ton as a therapist, probably the vast majority of my clients, not just in our job, although that's one big place, but it can be parenting, that I'm not a good enough mother, but I have to be perceived as a good enough mother by the other parents in the community, by my parents, by my in-laws, whatever it might be. So parenting, it shows up in my relationship. Am I a good wife? Do I attend to my partner? At least does public perception think that I attend to my partner, right? This is a big piece of the imposter syndrome. It's not just my self-assessment, but how do I perceive that others assess me? Yeah.
And the fear that they're going to assess you as a fraud and you don't know what you're doing. And there are 5 different types, and they show up 5 different ways, and you might encompass many of them. One of those is perfectionism. It's the idea that, and we had an episode on this, but the idea that I have to be perfect in order to be competent, and people won't see me as a fraud.
Without flaw.
Without flaw. The second one is expert. So I need to be an expert on this in order to feel competent enough. The problem is you often feel like there's always something to learn. So you never feel like the expert, and therefore you feel like an imposter. Well, I don't know everything there is about this topic or this job or parenting or whatever. So therefore I'm incompetent and people are going to find me out. The other is like this natural genius. And this is like this idea that there's an expectation that you should just naturally be intelligent or genius. And because you're not in certain areas, you're a fraud.
Right. Unworthy, not good enough.
Yep, not worthy, good enough. The other one is like what they call soloist. This is where you feel like people have helped you to get where you're at, and you don't really attribute any of your success to yourself. It's other people helping you, so you don't feel competent enough. Again, like you feel like a fraud that shouldn't be in this position, or a parent, or whatever it might be. And then the other one is like this super person where you feel like the only way you can be competent is if you work hard to the bone.
All the time.
And if you aren't working hard enough, then you're not competent, and you feel like people are going to find you out.
Why is it that I resonate with like every one of those as you're saying them? I'm like, oh yeah, that's me too.
I mean, here's the thing is personally, like I've been in seeing clients for over 10 years. I still feel imposter syndrome.
All the time. And
this comes up in a lot of professions, a lot. And it sucks. It sucks to feel that way, that you're not competent. And oftentimes it's an imbalance of where our assessment of our competency lies. And it's typically when we're not doing good enough, or we're failing, or it's just maybe not really an accurate assessment. For an example, in that case would be like, as a therapist, we're spitting out terms that they're so normal to us, but for someone else it could be life-changing.
I had this happen the other day where I shared an idea or a concept, and to me, I was like, oh, that's such a lame one. Like I use this all the time. And with that client, they literally paused and they're like, oh my gosh, I've never thought about it that way.
Right.
And it shifted their perspective profoundly in that moment. So I take for granted that knowledge that seems basic or obvious wasn't always basic or obvious to me. I learned it somewhere.
Yeah. And we become numb to it. We become numb to the experience of it helping, because it's just so normal to us. And I do that with clients when I give them homework. I'm like, oh my God, they probably think this is so juvenile. Like I know it's going to help them, but they probably, that fear, they're going to think I'm a fraud. And that comes up a lot. So it is a normal process. And you see this a lot anytime there's like performance or something where you feel like you're performing or achieving.
Even parenting.
Which is performance. Yep. Right. There's anxiety around performing as a good parent.
I think about, am I parenting well for the sake of my kids?
Yeah.
But also, do others perceive me parenting well? So I often think like, well, my kids still melt down. They're still a mess. So, oh man, I'm not a good mom. My kids are struggling. And then when someone, and I encourage you guys to do this, point it out to people when they're doing well, because when other people point out of, oh, you're attuned to her, or, oh, I like what you just did there as a parent. I take for granted, to me, it's like, that wasn't good enough. She still had a meltdown. To other people, oh, I never would have thought about it that way. Or I never would have done that with my child, but I'm going to try that, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And really it goes back to what we're talking about, the assessment of our competency. And oftentimes it's not accurate. We're really only assessing and paying attention to what is wrong. What about all the times that we've had successes? All the times that you've helped somebody, or all the times that you did well? And there's kind of like this, false or unhelpful expectation that you need to be perfect or know everything, or going back to those kind of 5. And that's where, I guess, for example, challenging these expectations would be helpful.
Which is hard. The
meaning you make if you don't meet that. What does that mean about you?
Our brain is skewed to see, again, those threats, those negatives, the things I'm doing wrong. And so to be able to have an accurate assessment of myself, of my parenting, my job, whatever it might be, can be rather challenging.
Ugh, yeah, it's not a good feeling.
No.
I mean, it leads to anxiety, and over time, it
doubting myself,
depression. I mean, it can lead to a lot of different symptoms. Yeah. I mean, in terms of like causes, like why do people experience this and some don't? Some of it, it's just if you're naturally like socially anxious.
If you're more sensitive.
Yep.
Right. As an HSP, there are things that, like, say I have a client and they give me critical feedback, which I ask for because I want to grow, or I have someone who stops coming to therapy. It's really hard for me to not go down the rabbit hole of, oh, what did I screw up? I knew I shouldn't be a therapist. I'm probably not good for other people. Whereas my partner would receive that as, well, what do they have going on in their life? Right. And so my perception is very skewed to seeing what's my fault.
Yeah.
How am I an imposter? How am I not perfect? How am I not the expert? What did I do wrong?
Yeah.
So we can also have someone in tandem helping us challenge those thoughts. Are they rational? Are they factual? Or are they built out of this fear that I'm not good enough?
Yeah. And by HSP, you're referring to a highly sensitive person. Right?
It also comes from our home, right? If I have a parent that's always saying, you need to push harder. Why did you get a B? Why did you let that person beat you? Right? We hear this a lot with sports. You have to be the best athlete. I had a client who said, second is last. Like in their house, second really was last place. And they even got punished. So I've had clients who had to run extra laps, had to do extra chores, whatever it might be, for not being the top performer, for making a mistake.
And the narrative that develops over time, my goodness. Oh my, again, go back. What's the meaning that you make when you don't meet these expectations of being perfect, the expert,
failure,
doing it by your own, failure, not good enough. I'm an imposter and people are going to find me out. One way to help kind of that we're also just hit on is challenging those thoughts, but also focusing on your successes deliberately, writing a list of the times that we have to provide balance. Our brain is skewed to those negatives that you talked about. So now we need to intentionally, and it takes energy, put the positives in there as more of adaptive thoughts of look how I've helped.
Often when we ask clients, what are your strengths? What are your growing edges or weaknesses? Oh, they can list the weaknesses. But if I say, what are the strengths of you or your partnership? I don't know. Right? Because our brain is so geared to seeing what's going wrong.
Yeah. The imperfections.
Yeah. And so we can actually pause and say, well, actually, yeah, my child melted down and they had a hard day, but they were overtired. They were hungry. They were human. And we had a great interaction just 30 minutes before. If I can take that time to actually assess, oh, it's not the totality of my motherhood in one moment.
Yeah.
It is but one moment. Right.
Yeah. And how do you see in the realm of parenting that if the parent feels like an imposter, how might that actually carry over into the child?
Such a good one. Right. So I think about this as with imposter syndrome. If I'm afraid of failing, I'm going to not take up opportunities. So I might not take a new job or apply for that job. I might not travel to that place. I might pass up on these cool things. Same with parenting. I might disengage because I don't want to risk screwing up my kiddo. So I'm just going to take a step back. But also if my child hears me saying, oh, I'm such a failure of a mother, that's a dialogue she's now building about motherhood that she'll probably say when she's a mother.
And she'll use against you as an adolescent.
Oh gosh, I'm terrified.
So, but, and do you ever, I'm wondering and thinking about this, do you ever feel like they'll use the child as a barometer in their behavior as their success? And that's where the blame is coming from.
100%. You see this in competitive schools or different things.
Oh my God.
Right. But how do I talk about that mistake? How do I talk about, okay, if I yell at my child, do I put blame on them? Do I tear myself apart? Or do I say, man, Harper, I've had a rough day. Mommy's sorry. Or like if my child spills something, do I harp into her about that? Or do I say, mistakes happen. We'll clean it up. Right. This helps her to where she doesn't have to feel like she has to be perfect. She doesn't have to be without flaw. She can take risks and miss the mark at the same time.
Yeah.
But also genuinely believing that in myself, which is really freaking hard.
Yeah. It starts with the acceptance on your part, right? Of not having to be perfect or,
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very tough one. It's not a diagnosable thing, but it comes up so much in therapy. And again, like, as you said, we have experienced it ourselves. I find helpful for myself is when I talk to other people in my field who experience it, that I have respect for, and they experience it, then it normalizes it for me. I'm okay to feel this. So instead of fighting it, I'm kind of laying it into it. Like, this is just part of the process. Yeah. And you kind of see it in a way that it actually helps you to drive to go learn more. And as long as you're okay with it, but saying, okay, you know what, like, it's okay to feel this way. I'm not going to be perfect, but I also want to go learn more to help kind of, reduce some of the anxiety that I get around it.
How do you see this show up in couples or with one partner? Sometimes I imagine one partner might struggle with this and the other might not, or both might. How do you see it show up?
I've seen it more as an external thing. So not something that they feel like an imposter in the relationship, but at their job or something. And I'll see that they don't feel good enough there. And that gets exacerbated when something goes on in the relationship. So for example, I have a partner who is just started a new job and they're like hoping they're doing a good enough job. And then they come home and the partner's like, I need this. And they'll just say they'll do it in a good way. Like, I feel blah, blah, blah. Like, I need more X. And the partner just thinks like they're failing. And so
it's almost like this broad sweeping, failing at work, failing at home, I'm a failure.
Yeah. And then that of course changes how they treat their partner, or maybe they disengage. I mean,
how do you see that shift in behavior as a result?
So they'll, like, that partner might, however they respond to the increased stress or sense of failure, whether they distance or they take it off on criticism or bring other people down to make themselves feel better. Because you see that a lot, right? With the criticism is they don't feel good about themselves. So I need to bring someone else down so I can feel somewhat normal, because I'm a fraud. I need to expose you. So
I think it's normal to feel this. What can be, I don't want to say abnormal, but what can be unhealthy is, how do I respond to this? Right? Yeah. Many of us feel like imposters at some point in our life. Some of us
our whole life.
Our whole life. But then how do I respond to it?
Yeah. Yeah, the response is key. And this is where we talk about denormalizing the challenging thoughts. In previous episodes, we talked about cognitive behavioral therapy. And that really helps understand what are the underlying thoughts that are driving this insecurity. What are my core beliefs about myself? And how do my beliefs about myself affect how I see how other people evaluate me?
How do I shift those?
Yeah.
So that CBT thought log.
Yep.
My initial thought is I'm a failure. Now, if I take that zoom out approach and I pause, what evidence do I have for that? What thought would I rather be thinking? What compassion can I bestow upon myself or my partner? Yeah.
What's evidence? I like to, sometimes I stay away from in some cases, I think it's good to say, like, what evidence do you have that you're a failure or whatever, because people are so good at, oh, I failed because of this, let me tell you. And then the whole log's filled out with just that. I tend to go the opposite. Like, what's evidence that you are a good parent?
Yep.
What's evidence that you are good at your job, that you didn't fail? Or even more of the acceptance approach as an adaptive thought of other people have made mistakes and it's been okay.
I'll say things, and it's a little bit crass or direct, but I'll say to people, like, what would you say to a friend? Right.
Oh yeah.
And then I'll say, what makes you so special that you don't get that compassion? What makes you different? Why do you not deserve that same levity, that same grace, that same space to enjoy the mistakes, not just wallow in them and destroy ourselves over them?
I had this client who is Christian, and their expectations were very high. Perfectionism is key, and expert they would fall under. And I was like, okay, so you want to be Jesus? And they laughed, like, oh my gosh. And so anytime something came up, they're like, I don't have to be Jesus. I don't have to be Jesus. Like,
I say that all the time. You're not the Messiah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I need to be close to. No, you really don't. Right.
Yeah. That acceptance of imperfection is going to be key, that you don't have to be expert. You're not going to know everything, that it's okay to have gotten support. And you probably wouldn't have got that support if someone didn't see the value in you and that competence.
What a blessing. Right. So rather than being something I have to pay for the rest of my life, reframing as a blessing. How am I going to use this? Well, is there a way, for some people even talking about like okay, it is a blessing. And I didn't have to do it all by myself. But can I bestow that same courtesy to someone else? Can I use that to move forward too?
And you don't have to do it all yourself.
Yeah, you shouldn't do it. Should. I don't mean should on people here, but we aren't meant to do things by ourselves as humans. We are meant to do it in connection, in support, in relationship, whether it is a job or balancing homework, relationship, or parenting.
And this sucks because yes, we want support, but there's something in our culture that where people undermine other people's accomplishments and said, you've gotten carried. Other people's backs hurts because they carried you the whole way to where you're at. You don't deserve this. The jealousy, right? And this is why another way to help with this imposter syndrome is moderate your social media use and stop comparing yourself to other people.
Clean it up. If you're scrolling through Instagram and you are struggling with your weight and you're following Instagram models that are size 0, 6'4", and makes you feel shitty about yourself, unfollow.
Yep.
If you're following friends,
we put it in there.
If you're following friends who bring you down, who irritate you, who make you judge yourself or feel like, shit, I'm not perfect enough, or I've got to keep up this perception of myself.
Yeah.
Clean up your social media. Don't make it another place where you're reminded of, God, I'm not good enough.
Yeah, because as you said in previous episodes, you call it the highlight reel, which I love.
Oh.
Social media is a highlight reel. And, maybe this sounds kind of cynic, I guess, if you will, but I like to talk to people who are willing to say that they're fuck ups.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh yes, please tell me how you feel. Okay, I feel so much better about myself. You're worse than me. No, I don't say that. Yeah, right? It is normal. As long as you don't go and be like, oh yeah, you're worse than me. But
please don't say that.
It goes back to this idea of normalizing it and that other people are okay to express that they're human. And that's a very hard thing in a culture where we're very egocentric and we feel like we're always in the spotlight and everyone's looking at me and every mistake, and people are uncomfortable expressing that vulnerability. But when you put boundaries around your social media and even friends and people who don't exacerbate the imposter syndrome, then you can be with people who can discuss these things and bring you down to kind of level and okay, this is normal. The people I respect feel this way. They're human.
And they're not judging me. I talked to a client about her living room versus her closet. Her living room, immaculate if someone's coming over. Her closet is a total cluster. Sometimes we have to let the closet out too, right? We have this propensity as people. Everything's got to be perfectly tidy, perfect. My job has to be the best job ever. I have to have the biggest home, whatever it might be, to be perfect, to not be perceived as an imposter. But what if you were authentic? What if when your friend's coming over, you don't pick up your living room?
Yeah. Who would still be in your life if you're authentic?
No one. I'm kidding. But like, who are those people that can come to my house and I'm in sweatpants and my house looks like a shit show and still love me just the same? And as I think about it, I know those people.
That's who you want.
And I know the other people who I always clean up for.
Yeah.
I fear their judgment. I fear, oh, shit, they're going to see I'm a mess.
Yeah.
I'm not totally put together.
Yeah. And, and there's some jobs out there that are very highly critical cultures, like coding and things like that, right? There's perfectionism bred into there. And maybe you decide that that's not for me. And you try into another job where you can feel more competent or get more support, because that support and validation that you're doing a good job is so important. And we're in a culture where I think it's very problem saturated and everyone wants to point out our flaws and we're our worst own critics. And so finding those places that can actually validate and support that kind of narrative for ourselves.
Right. It's leaning into accepting myself for who I am, not my idealistic self of all the ways I need to be expert, perfect, whatever it might be, but who am I with my flaws? What work culture, even if it's not changing the job, but just the place of employment. Therapists, we're terrible at tearing one another down, by the way. You'd think of therapists as being really supportive of everyone all the time. But it's, oh, do you have this credential? You don't.
I'm very highly critical. Don't come to me for support. But I'm just kidding.
And there is, of course, training. Like we want people to do well in this profession. But is there room for mistake? Is there room? Some group therapy practices, we work as a team. We collaborate. Other ones, it's very neck biting. This is my client. You can't have them.
Yeah.
This is my whatever.
Mine.
That's what I think of. I think of my toddler. So choosing a workspace that invites your flaws, that when you make a mistake has some grace, some latitude for that.
And to me, I would argue that that behavior you talked about, like in our culture, therapy culture, is a product of people seeking validation because of a lot of the imposter syndrome.
100%.
So it's really, when you think about people criticizing people or people seeking that validation, and they need the validation because we feel like imposters, which kind of gives cue that we all, it's part of being human.
Think about bullies. Bullies often pick on people for the very thing that they're most insecure about, the very thing that they're afraid of getting seen for.
Yeah.
It's the same thing here, right? If I have insecurities, I don't want people to see them in me. So I'm going to make sure to point them out in you, because it deflects from people seeing my real mistakes, my real flaws.
Yeah. And bringing them down to bring them to my level so I can feel good about myself, or wanting somebody to have that so bad that you tell them what they do so you can feel better about yourself, right?
It's hard because not all of this is conscious either.
No. Like 99% of this is not conscious.
Unless we sit and are introspective and take that time. Yeah. But even then there are scripts that aren't conscious, right? So when making this better, I encourage people, bring it to the forward. Do you give yourself grace? Do you, I talk about grace over guilt. Do you slow down and give yourself grace when you make mistakes, or do you wallow in the guilt and the shame? Do you encourage other people and give them grace and support, or do you condemn them?
Yeah. So I'm curious, I'm going to pivot here. I'm curious of your thoughts on that phrase, fake it till you make it. How does that play into the imposter syndrome world? I've been kind of like trying to rack my head around this as well.
It's a tough one. I can see both sides, because sometimes with things like anxiety, I'll encourage people, like, say it's affirmations, right? I'm asking people to affirm themselves. We don't always believe those affirmations to start. So almost that fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
Give yourself that affirmation until it starts to actually sink in. And yet people do feel this need to fake it until they make it. I'm going to pretend like I'm competent in every type of therapy to make sure my therapy practice is full.
Yeah.
I'm going to be the most.
Oh God, we know some of those.
It happens to people. I think about lawyers, right? I've got to have the snappiest suit. I've got to appear like I know everything about law, even if inside I'm like, should I have no clue what I'm doing? Yeah. What do you think?
I love that you said it. You gave two flips of the coins, because I'm more on the side of that. It's really just, to me, a byproduct. That statement is saying that you don't believe in yourself and that you have to fake it. But I also agree with the other side of that, of there's times where you're going to have to push through it and gain the confidence through the process. So it does go both. And I always wonder, I look at the client and how they use it. I look at how I use it myself and say, is this helpful? Is it just saying like, fake it till you make it, and it's not giving me any credit for where I've been successful in the things I know? Because again, as we talked about previously, we have so much experience with this that what we know has become so normative that we think everybody knows it. And so we actually think we know nothing. But in reality, a lot of people don't know this stuff.
Right.
I mean, there's a small percentage of the country that even have their like doctorates or even their masters and gotten to that level to understand some of the stuff that we're teaching. But again, we do it so much, it's norm. And then we become like, oh, we're an imposter. Like they already know this stuff. And then most of the time clients don't know this stuff.
I think about my husband with finance. He'll come home and spit out stuff about finances and oh my gosh, all the things and savings and I don't even know what the words are. And I'm sitting there like, what language is this man speaking in? And to him, he's like, oh, this is just normal knowledge. And so part of this too is try to give yourself credit for that piece. You do have skills. They may look different than Susie Q down the street. They may look different than your coworker, but you still have skills. So giving yourself, I don't know what the word is here, but giving yourself some kudos for what you do know. Also invite yourself, if there is an area you're falling short and you want to learn more, rather than just faking it, rather than judging yourself, take the time, learn something more about it. You still won't be perfect. Knowledge is always changing, but give yourself the chance to fine tune that skill or take on a new skill. Try something new, try a new sport, try a new hobby. Even if it completely falls on its face, at least you try.
Go to therapy, work on self-esteem. Go work on some of the things that drive down that insecurity of not being good enough. Learn where it comes from. And
your narratives.
Find ways to kind of reauthor those narratives of where maybe that came from being highly critical parents or being a perfectionist itself. It's kind of like, it's like a cycle, right? So you need perfectionism to say, for example, someone need to be perfect, because if I was perfect, my parents wouldn't yell at me. But then they've learned that as a coping skill, and maybe it survived through there. But then over time, we never meet perfect. So then you start not liking yourself. And now you have to engage in perfect or expect perfect to even feel competent.
But the interesting dynamic that happens there is if I pretend like I'm perfect all the time, that can actually push people further away. So while I'm trying to be over here perfect so that no one judges me, people will see that it's disingenuous. People want neutrality. People want vulnerability. People want to see, oh, you're a mess too. So if I'm always perfect, I'll actually lose relationship rather than gain it, at least quality ones.
And we see that a lot of you expect to be perfect, but it almost comes with more criticism from people, which almost cuts it. It falls on its face, right? Because other people don't like that you're perfect. Because then they feel bad about themselves. So then that adds to your narrative of not being good enough. So then it drives that need to be perfect even more. I mean, it's a very hard trap, and going and challenging the thoughts, finding ways to normalize it, really identify your core beliefs that might be driving this not being good enough, working with a therapist, pushing yourself out and challenging your expectation to be perfect or know it all or what have you, or doing it all by yourself and no support. Reset those goalposts for yourself that you don't need that to be a good human being.
Love on your friends around you. If you're with a friend who's having a hard day, point out how amazing they are. Even if it's just like a normal day, right? Like sometimes I'll text some of my girlfriends and say like, you're an incredible mom. Even if it's unprompted, right? Just getting a little bit of validation can go a long way, right? If my partner's having a hard time, I know, Chris, this is a tough day. And look at all the great things you did earlier. Look at what you did with Harper. Yes, you're having a hard moment and you're still incredible in these ways. Or how can I support you and love you through this? How can I be beside you rather than judging him and saying, yeah, you should have, or why didn't you?
Yeah.
Not helpful. That phrase is never helpful, especially here.
Yeah. And supporting the narrative that it's okay to be imperfect. We're allowed to be human.
Perfectly imperfect.
Yeah. Perfectly imperfect. That's human. Wonderful. I tell a lot of clients, and I'm surprised that it comes back so much, because this is one of the things that I'm like, oh God, everyone's heard this. It's in songs. Then I'm like, and they talk about fighting. I'm like, okay, so you're human. And they come back and I'll be like, that has stuck with me so much that it's human to fight, because there's this narrative that it's not okay to fight. And I see this with clients who maybe grew up in a household where their parents didn't fight at all. And that it's normal, or that it's not doom and gloom, that their parents fought and it led to divorce. Well, fighting doesn't always lead to divorce.
And every couple fights. Even with sex, right? Like I'll hear couples say, well, everyone else has sex every week or 5 times a week. Actually, they don't. Here's a hint. They don't. We all have the moments where it's hot and heavy. And then there's moments when it's more of a dry spell. It comes into almost every facet of our life of I've got to be perceived as X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. And it goes back to this idea of perfection. I love this because I've had clients that were, a lot of the big issues around the frequency of sex. And then I get down into it and I realize they're having sex like 4 times a week. And I'm like, do you know what healthy is? It's 2 times a week. And that's not even the norm, and it's just, but their expectation is there.
And because their friend is saying, I have sex 5 times a week, which they're probably lying. Right. But now we build expectations on what could be truth or not truth. It could be truth.
Yep.
But just because that's their truth doesn't mean it has to be your truth.
Yeah. But it's like that narrative, that expectation will, okay. And that's fine if they set that. But more importantly, what is the meaning you're applying to not meeting some said standard?
Our relationship is less than theirs. I'm not good enough. My partner's not attracted to me.
That's a big one. Yep. So yeah, imposter syndrome is, wow, it's a beast, and it gets everybody. I wish there was a way that we can continue from a cultural standpoint early on to breed confidence in ourselves and not rely on external factors to define our values. Because I think this is a big piece of it. I think about school and the gold stars and the grades. That's all value of my work that's shown socially. But when do we learn it internally? And this is a big part of it, because that's what's happening internally, is our feeling of not being good enough to, guess what, something external that was set by whom?
Right.
At what point can we learn to love ourselves and accept?
And love the journey, including the mistakes, including the bumps, including the learning moments, the flaws, the points when I had to say, actually, I can't do this, or I'm incompetent in this area and I need someone else to help me, show me, do it, whatever.
Yeah.
I wish we would teach that more in schools of, it's not just about the A people. No. It's what work did you put in? What did you learn? What did you gain
Yeah.
in yourself? How did you challenge yourself?
Yeah.
What did you learn from those mistakes? We don't learn from the success. We learn from the mistakes.
And it's sad too, because there's very intelligent kids who have grown on to be adults that are very successful, but they didn't get A's because they had ADHD or things that weren't identified, but they were seen as not a good student, because that was the metric that's been defining whether you're good enough in the schools. And think about how that narrative carries on. I mean, it's such a problem, in my opinion, in terms of with our self-esteem and whether we feel like imposters or not.
My biggest takeaway is try to lean into your genuine self, which isn't perfect. If you have friendships that you know you have to change who you are, reevaluate those friendships, reevaluate your boundaries. Really leaning into my authentic self, my messy, whole self. When I can do that, I am at better peace of mind. My body's happier, my gut's happier, my relationships are happier, my kids are happier. Whereas if I'm always trying to put on a show, I'm miserable, and it has a ripple effect out.
Yeah, because you're not authentic. Yeah. And my piece of advice, and this includes talking to myself, is asking yourself, okay, if I wasn't perfect or not an expert, or I had someone help me, what's the worst case scenario? What would happen? Why
does it matter? What's the meaning?
And then the other thing is, like, say, perfectionism or being the expert. Okay, well, why don't you go expose yourself to not being an expert in a context? What's the worst that could happen? Why don't you make a mistake? What could happen? What's the worst that could happen?
Take the risk.
Expose yourself to desensitize you to that it's okay.
And if people judge me, again, I say this and I know it's such a struggle, but who cares? Right? For me, I'm like, I care. Everyone cares, right?
Yeah.
So I know that narrative, but it's challenging myself of, okay, make a mistake. I look silly. Who cares? Right?
Yeah.
My partner at the end of the day, still going to love me. I'm still going to be here. My kids are still going to love me. So does it really matter what Joe Blow thinks? No, it doesn't.
They're not perfect either.
And if it does matter to them, if my friend is judging me, why am I in friendship with them? This has been Relationships Inside Out, where we've talked about imposter syndrome, or this feeling of we've got to be the perfect person, the expert, have it all together all the time. Otherwise, we're a failure.
Or fraud.
Right? If anyone has any questions, topic suggestions, anything like that, please feel free to email us at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. Otherwise, we look forward to chatting with you next time.
Thanks.